The room went silent. Not the normal courtroom silence. Not the polite, expected kind. This was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like everyone suddenly forgot how to breathe. And right in the middle of it stood Prince Harry. Hands clenched, jaw tight, eyes locked on a single sheet of paper that was never supposed to cause this kind of reaction. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Here's the question no one in that courtroom was ready to ask out loud. What happens when proof doesn't bring peace, but instead triggers total collapse? Because that's what this moment was meant to do. End everything. Close the case. Settle the argument once and for all. DNA doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about titles, legacy, or reputation. So why did Prince Harry refuse to accept it? That's the part that stunned everyone. Judges, lawyers, reporters. Even people who thought they'd seen it all. This wasn't just disagreement. This wasn't confusion. This was rejection. Full, visible, undeniable rejection of the results placed directly in front of him. And before you jump to conclusions, slow down. Because this story isn't about science. It's about identity. It's about what happens when the version of yourself you've carried for decades suddenly starts to crack. Ask yourself this for a second. If everything you believed about your past was challenged in public, under oath, with cameras rolling, would you stay calm? Harry didn't. But what makes this moment explosive isn't just the outburst. It's the timing, the context, the fact that this hearing was supposed to be routine, almost boring, a legal formality wrapped in procedure and paperwork. Instead, it became something else entirely. For years, questions have followed him. About truth, about loyalty, about who he really is and who he can trust. Some of those questions were whispered, some were shouted. But this was the first time they were backed by something tangible, something final. And that's where the tension begins. Because when the judge prepared to read the results, everyone assumed the reaction would be predictable. Relief, vindication, maybe quiet acceptance. No one expected denial. No one expected anger. And absolutely no one expected what happened next. Look closely at moments like this, and you'll see the real story hiding underneath. This wasn't about winning or losing a case. This was about control, about refusing to let a single document rewrite a lifetime narrative. Short breaths, shifting eyes, a chair scraping the floor. Something inside Harry snapped, and the courtroom felt it. The media would later call it a breakdown. Critics would label it arrogance. Supporters would say it was pain finally surfacing. But in that moment, none of those labels mattered. All that mattered was this. The truth had arrived, and Prince Harry wasn't ready to hear it. And as the judge finished reading the results and lifted their eyes toward him, Harry stood up, not calmly, not carefully, but with a force that made everyone realize this hearing was no longer under control. Because what he did next wasn't just unexpected. It was about to change everything. Below is the next section of the script, picking up directly from the last cliffhanger. It is over 400 words, follows the retention rules, and ends on a strong cliffhanger. The moment Prince Harry stood up, everything shifted. This was no longer a controlled legal proceeding. It was something raw, unpredictable, dangerous. Up until that second, the courtroom had followed a script. Lawyers spoke when spoken to. The judge maintained calm authority. Even the tension had a structure to it. But when Harry pushed his chair back and rose to his feet, the script vanished. Here's the strange part. No one stopped him immediately. Not the judge, not the attorneys, not even security. Why? Because everyone thought he was about to say something measured, something formal, maybe a request for clarification, maybe a procedural objection. After all, this was Prince Harry. Publicly emotional at times, yes, but still expected to stay within the lines when it mattered most. That assumption lasted about 2 seconds. Harry didn't ask a question. He didn't seek clarification. He rejected the premise entirely. Imagine that. A courtroom built on evidence and procedure, and the person at the center of it simply refusing to accept the foundation it stands on. Short sentences, sharp tone, a voice that wasn't shaking with confusion, but with fury. And that's when people started exchanging looks. Because this wasn't confusion. Confusion sounds uncertain. This was conviction. Harry spoke like a man who had already decided the truth was wrong. Think about how rare that is. DNA evidence is treated as the final word. It ends arguments. It closes doors. Courts rely on it because it doesn't care about feelings. But Harry wasn't reacting like someone surprised by bad news. He was reacting like someone whose entire sense of self had just been threatened. Ask yourself this. If you knew something deep down, something you'd always believed, and suddenly a piece of paper told you it was false, who would you trust? The paper? Or the life you've lived? Harry chose the latter. That choice rippled through the room. Lawyers stiffened. The judge leaned forward. A murmur spread through the gallery before being shut down instantly. This was not going as planned. What made it worse was the confidence Harry displayed. He didn't sound unsure. He didn't sound scared. He sounded offended, as if the results themselves were an insult. That reaction confused even people who were sympathetic to him, because if the results were wrong, there were procedures to challenge them. Motions, experts, appeals. Not this. Not standing up in open court and rejecting reality in real time. And here's where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Harry had agreed to the test, pushed for it, according to some accounts. He wanted finality. He wanted answers. So why, when the answer arrived, did he explode? Was it because the result didn't match what he expected? Or because it confirmed something he'd spent years trying not to think about? The judge finally spoke, attempting to regain control. Calm voice. Firm words. A reminder that this was a court of law, not a personal confrontation. Harry didn't sit down. That's when the tension turned from uncomfortable to alarming. Because the refusal wasn't just emotional anymore. It was procedural defiance. And in a courtroom, defiance has consequences. The judge paused, looked at Harry, then glanced toward the officers standing near the wall. And in that brief moment, before anyone moved, it became clear that this hearing was no longer about DNA. It was about what happens when someone refuses to accept a truth powerful enough to dismantle them. And what the judge did next would decide whether this moment ended as an outburst or turned into something far more serious. The judge didn't raise their voice. That's what made it unsettling. Instead of shouting or banging the gavel, the judge simply paused. Let the silence stretch, long enough to force everyone in the room to feel it, long enough for the tension to crawl under the skin. Then came the warning. Measured, precise, legal language wrapped around a clear message. Sit down, or this stops being a hearing. Harry didn't respond right away. And that hesitation, that single beat, told the room everything it needed to know. Because in that pause, you could see the war playing out on his face. Not between lawyers, not between families, but between two realities. One backed by evidence, the other backed by memory, emotion, and identity. Ask yourself this. When you're cornered by the truth, do you fight it, or do you freeze? Harry chose neither. He doubled down. What followed wasn't a scream. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was something colder, more controlled, and somehow more disturbing. He began speaking again, this time slower, more deliberate, as if trying to dismantle the entire process piece by piece. The test, the lab, the chain of custody, the motives behind ordering it in the first place. Everything was suddenly suspicious. That's when the courtroom realized something crucial. This wasn't about proving the DNA wrong. This was about preserving a version of reality that Harry could still live with. Think about that contradiction for a moment. He trusted the system enough to agree to the test, trusted it enough to show up, trusted it enough to expect validation. But the second it didn't deliver the answer he wanted, the system became corrupt. That's a hard pill for anyone to swallow, especially in public, especially with cameras capturing every shift in expression. The judge attempted to redirect again, calmly reminding him that emotional reactions, while understandable, did not change evidence. That this was not a debate. It was a determination. Harry laughed. Not loudly, not mockingly, just a short, sharp sound that didn't belong in a courtroom at all. That sound hit harder than yelling ever could. Because laughter in a moment like this isn't relief. It's disbelief turning into defiance. The gallery reacted immediately. Head snapped up. A few gasps slipped out before order was called. Even the lawyers looked momentarily unprepared for that response. And here's where things took a turn no one expected. Instead of backing down, Harry challenged the premise outright. Not legally, personally. He spoke about history, about what he'd been told, about how certain things don't show up in tests or charts. Emotion over evidence. Identity over data. That's when the judge stopped him. Not gently, firmly. This was the line. And as the judge explained the potential consequences of continuing down this path, contempt, removal, escalation, something shifted again. You could see it in Harry's posture, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched. He was cornered now, not by the DNA, but by authority. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Courts don't bend to belief. They bend to compliance. The officers near the wall adjusted their stance. Subtle, almost unnoticeable, but everyone saw it. This was no longer symbolic. This was about to become physical. The judge issued one final instruction. Clear, non-negotiable. Sit down, or be removed. Harry looked around the room. At the lawyers, the judge, the officers, the audience, and for a split second, it looked like he might finally comply. But then he said something, quiet, controlled, and devastating, that reframed the entire situation. Something that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd questioned this truth. Something that hinted this DNA result didn't come out of nowhere. And as the judge's expression changed, it became clear that what Harry had just implied could open an entirely new kind of legal and personal consequences. Because if what he was suggesting was true, then this case wasn't over. It was just beginning. Harry's words hung in the air longer than anything else he'd said that day. Not because they were loud, not because they were dramatic, but because they suggested something no one in that room had been prepared to consider. The judge didn't interrupt this time. That alone was telling. Up until now, every deviation had been corrected, redirected, controlled. But this landed differently. Harry wasn't denying the test anymore. He was implying that the truth the court thought it had just uncovered might have been circling him for years. And that changed everything. You could feel the shift instantly. The lawyers who had been confidently organized moments earlier began flipping through documents again, faster this time. One of them whispered something urgently to another. The calm certainty that had defined the hearing evaporated. Because here's the uncomfortable question Harry had just placed on the table without formally asking it. What if the DNA result didn't shock him because it was wrong? What if it shocked him because it confirmed something he'd been warned about long ago? That possibility sent a ripple through the courtroom. Think about how different those two scenarios are. One is denial. The other is dread. One is arrogance. The other is fear finally catching up. Harry's posture changed as well. The anger was still there, but now it was layered with something else. Resentment, frustration, maybe even betrayal. He spoke about conversations from the past, about things said in private, about questions that were brushed aside instead of answered. No specifics. Not yet, but enough to make it clear this reaction wasn't spontaneous. The judge leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing, not in irritation, but in calculation. Judges don't do emotion. They do implications. And the implications of what Harry was hinting at were serious. If prior doubts existed and were ignored, if information had been withheld, if this test wasn't the beginning, but the confirmation, then the narrative flips completely. Suddenly, Harry doesn't look like a man rejecting reality. He looks like a man furious that reality waited until now to reveal itself. But here's the contradiction that makes this moment almost unbearable. If he suspected this all along, why demand the test? Why bring this into court? Why force a moment he wasn't prepared to survive? That question hovered unspoken. And maybe that's the real tragedy of it. Sometimes people seek answers hoping they'll be wrong. Hoping the truth will contradict their worst fears. Hoping for relief. Harry didn't get relief. He got confirmation, or at least enough of it to unravel him. The judge finally spoke again, slower this time. More careful. Acknowledging that certain claims, if substantiated, could not be addressed in this session. That implications raised without evidence could not derail established procedure. In other words, whatever Harry was hinting at would require a different legal battlefield. That's when the realization hit him. You could see it. This courtroom wasn't going to give him the reckoning he wanted. Not today. Not like this. The rules were too rigid. The timeline too controlled. The truth too narrow. And that realization hurt more than the DNA ever could. Harry exhaled sharply, looked down, then back up. And in that moment of clarity, something else became obvious. This wasn't the end of his fight with the truth. It was the beginning of a much bigger one. Because as the judge prepared to adjourn and restore order, one of the attorneys stood and asked for something unexpected. A request that suggested there was more evidence. More history. More questions the DNA alone couldn't answer. And as the judge paused to consider that request, it became clear that the next phase of this story would no longer be about science. It would be about secrets, and who had been keeping them. The request caught everyone off guard. Not because it was loud or dramatic, but because of what it implied. Up until that moment, the DNA test had been treated as the finish line, the final word, the thing that would put an end to whispers and speculation. But now, with a single unexpected motion from one of the attorneys, the entire purpose of the hearing shifted. Here's the unsettling question that suddenly mattered more than the results themselves. If DNA was the truth, why was there more to uncover? The judge didn't respond immediately. Instead, they scanned the room again, the same room that had already been pushed to the edge once that day. You could feel the weight of the decision pressing down. Grant the request, and this case explodes into something far bigger. Deny it, and questions linger forever. Harry looked up sharply. This was different. Moments ago, he'd been fighting the court. Now the court might be opening a door he didn't expect to walk through. And that's where the tension sharpened. Because sometimes the thing you demand most is also the thing you fear the most. The attorney began outlining the request carefully, not accusing anyone directly, not making bold claims, just enough context to suggest there were inconsistencies, gaps, timelines that didn't quite align with the narrative everyone thought they knew. Birth records, old correspondence, conversations that were never meant to resurface. Nothing definitive yet. But enough to make one thing clear. The DNA test wasn't the beginning of this story. It was the trigger. Harry's reaction changed again. The anger softened, replaced by something more dangerous, focus. He wasn't spiraling now. He was listening. Closely. Ask yourself this. What's more terrifying, being proven wrong, or being proven right about something you've avoided your entire life? Because if this line of inquiry moved forward, it wouldn't just challenge the court's findings. It would reopen history, personal history, family history, the kind that can't be neatly contained in legal documents. The judge finally spoke, acknowledging that the request raised serious questions, but also serious risks. This wasn't just about evidence. It was about precedent, about opening doors that couldn't be closed once stepped through. And then came the phrase no one expected to hear. Further review. Not approval. Not denial. A pause. That pause hit Harry harder than any ruling could have. Because pauses mean waiting. And waiting means thinking. And thinking means replaying every moment, every doubt, every half-answered question that suddenly feels louder than ever. The judge set a date. Not far off. Close enough to keep the tension alive. Far enough to let speculation explode outside those walls. As the session adjourned, the courtroom began to move again. Chairs scraped. Papers shuffled. Voices returned. But the energy was different now. Less explosive. More ominous. Harry didn't leave right away. He stood there, staring at the bench, as if expecting something else to be said. Something final. Something that would tell him who he really was. But courts don't give answers like that. They give time. And time can be far crueler than truth. As he finally turned to leave, one of the attorneys leaned in and said something quietly to him. Too quiet for microphones. Too quick for cameras. Harry's face changed instantly. Not anger. Not denial. Recognition. And as he walked out of the courtroom without looking back, it became painfully clear that whatever was coming next, he had just been reminded of it. And if what he'd just heard was true, then the next hearing wouldn't just challenge evidence. It would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself. Because some truths